Mark Boslough is the first talk of the meeting this year, last year, maybe next year. Misinformation associated with airbursts and cratering impacts was the abstract title, but the talk title is Impact Misinformation, Pseudoscience, and Airburst Archaeology.
Thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I've given this talk several times. I've given it at the Planetary Defense Conference. I gave it at GSA for the first time 2 years ago to groups of skeptics, groups of amateur astronomers, and I change it for every presentation. But it's not a technical presentation. It's primarily intended to be entertaining. So this is I always use this as my title slide. Has anybody else seen the one on the right? If you do, if you see it in a news story, you know it's clickbait. You know it's not serious journalism. That is not Tunguska. The one on the left I know is Tunguska because I took that picture out of the window of a helicopter. Let's see. Okay, let's make sure. Okay, there we go. So I actually just ran across this recently, and if you can get past the old-timey 18th century gender bias, it still stands. You know, it is the duty of all of us, as far as our ability extends to detect and expose delusion and error, and that's particularly true in science. And I'm not here to pressure anybody or shame anybody, but I am here. One of the things I want to do is demonstrate that it is actually very rewarding and a fun thing to do. It's like solving puzzles. It's a combination of solving puzzles, doing research. You don't need any expensive equipment. All you need is access to the internet and to a library, and you can figure out a lot of things. So this is the version I presented at the Planetary Defense. This is just my title slide. And you can see I had a lot of co-authors, and these are all top-notch people. And they all got very involved in helping and finding their own threads to pull. And we ended up publishing a paper. And this paper got really long. It was originally just going to be a proceedings paper for the Planetary Defense Conference. It grew, and we submitted it to Meteoritics and Planetary Science special issue that is just coming out. It went online in May. It's not open access, but if you want a copy of it, I can share it by email. So just send me an email and I'll send you a copy. But it kept growing. It ended up being 8 pages longer than the standard size of a paper in that journal. So we ended up having to pay page charges and everything. So this is the very last day of the Planetary Defense Conference, and to prove I'm there, you can see me and Yvonne in the back row there with the arrows. The day after this was the last day of the conference. The next day we hit the road. Yvonne and I did a 10-day road trip. You can tell this is South Africa because we're driving on the wrong side of the road and the moon is upside down. And amateur astronomers always like that. We stayed in a very interesting hotel the first night, and we were the only ones there. And the reason is we had a friend of ours who's a geologist who does field work in the area, who recommended it and knew the proprietor really well. And so he let us stay there when it was closed. But it was kind of felt maybe a little like The Shining, being in a big empty lodge. But it was one of the interesting aspects of the lodge is it had books. Every vertical surface was covered with a bookshelf, and it was a sprawling hotel. And one of the things I noticed in looking at all these books was a whole rack full of back issues of the Guinness Book of World Records. And that immediately caught my attention because I had just given this presentation at the PDC. And one of the slides I showed was this one, because I was looking into the history of a couple of myths, that two claims that were clearly not true. And I was trying to push back. What was the primary source? Where did this actually come from? And they both appeared in this Wired story from 2000 So this was quite a while ago. The Tunguska event flattened 80 million trees. And the second one is if, based on the Earth's rotation, if it had struck 4 hours, 47 minutes, it would have obliterated St. Petersburg. But in Wired, this Wired story, they cited the Guinness Book of World Records, 1966 edition. Unfortunately, in that entire rack of books, there wasn't a 1966 edition, but there was a 1965 edition. And the 1965 edition, sure enough, said exactly that to the very minute. 4 hours and 47 minutes later, it would have wiped out St. Petersburg. But if you go back, to this Wired story, it sort of implies that the Guinness Book of Records concluded that. But Guinness Book of Records doesn't do research. They just, find stuff in other sources, but apparently don't cite them. So there had to be an earlier source. This got picked up by legitimate people. And I have to say, I never suspected this wasn't true until quite a while later. I thought about it, but John Lewis basically repeated it. He changed the timing a little bit. He must have done a little bit of a measurement. But when you think about it, so whoever repeats this and the original source of it, they must have just kind of assumed that it was like Shoemaker Levy 9. They neglected the fact that asteroids and comets are in orbit around the sun. They're in geocentric orbits, and the Earth is moving in its orbit. So it doesn't work that way. It worked for Shoemaker Levy 9 because that object was in orbit around Jupiter. And so Jupiter was rotating beneath it. So it was like throwing snowballs at a carousel. That's not the way objects going around the sun would hit the Earth. Devin French made the same mistake. He didn't pin himself down to a specific number of hours, but he basically said the same thing. So a couple years ago, I asked Paul Chodas, who actually was he and Don Yeomans at JPL were the ones that figured out that the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet was going to hit Jupiter. He's the guy who does the risk corridors for all the exercises, or the planetary defense exercises, or at least he did before he retired in April. So this is a risk corridor of an impact on a known orbit, but with some perturbation. So if it is a little leading or lagging, basically what Paul pioneered the method of doing is putting in these virtual impactors and doing kind of a Monte Carlo. So Peter Brown of University of Western Ontario gave him parameters, the best parameters of what we thought matched Tunguska, assuming that it was a beta Taurid. So being in a beta Taurid orbit, which the impact, what we understand about the impact, the angle it came in, the timing and everything else is consistent with that. We don't know the speed it was going, so we don't know for sure. But he perturbed an object in a beta Taurid orbit, and it's actually the other way around. If it hit the Earth later, if it was lagged, it wouldn't hit St. Petersburg, which is way over there. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but way over to the left, on the same latitude. That was the reasoning, the throwing the snowball at a carousel idea, but that's not how it works at all. And it turns out that if it had hit later, it would have been to the east, not to the west. And that's because it was a daytime impact. It was post-perihelion. And if you think about the direction the Earth is moving and an object that is just past the sun coming from that direction, if the Earth moves a little farther, the impact is going to be in the other direction. And it goes all the way across the Bering Sea and comes down across US cities, Fairbanks, Canadian cities as well, Winnipeg, and somewhere, I can't read it because it's behind, but somewhere Duluth, I think it was. But ironically, this dot is directly over London, Ontario, where Peter Brown was, the very last one. So eventually we did trace it back to its source, and it was a 1934 paper by this guy Stafovich, who actually published a lot of really good stuff about Tunguska. And I'm sure if he'd have thought about it, he would have known, he would have understood orbital mechanics back then to understand that this 4 hour, 47 minutes was not accurate. But that was the original source. There's the full quote in case you can't read it. So this and other that there's another bit of information that came out in this Sodom and Gomorrah paper. So this was the paper that came out in 2021, probably the most hyped paper, at least in our field, that I've ever seen. So the quote from the paper is, the airburst generated a pressure wave that toppled or snapped more than 80 million years. There's a greater than sign there, which is significant because they exaggerated everything, including the 1 meter in diameter. There are no trees. There never were trees a meter in diameter at Tunguska, and that is simply an exaggeration. But I looked at this is one of the first things I found when I read the paper. It's like, well, where did that actually come from? And this is what got me onto the 80 million trees problem to begin with. This was 2021, so 5 years ago when this came out. So citation 178 is to Brazzo and Austin, and it was some kind of review article. So I found it, and I actually found it online. And here it is. You can download the PDF. Let me move this box so I can read my own slide. Okay, so okay, there we go. So this is a quote from Brazzo and Austin. But is this a legitimate journal? Well, one clue might be right up here in the upper left. It is a journal of the Institute for Creation Research. So not particularly a scientific oriented journal, more of an agenda driven journal, but they present themselves, they pitch it as a peer reviewed journal. And apparently that tricked the authors here of the scientific reports papers. So that was something that we decided we wanted to get to the bottom of. And with the help of Andy Bruno, who's a historian who recently wrote a book about Tunguska from a historian's perspective, and I highly recommend it. It really does a good job summarizing the history of research all the way back, to Kulik and how scientists figured out that it was an airburst, which I didn't even know, even though I'm an airburst modeler and I've modeled the Tunguska airburst. It wasn't really understood to be an airburst until after the Hiroshima bombing and after aerial surveys of the Tunguska site. So it really wasn't known back when these papers were written. But the Brazzo and Austin cited Whipple. But Whipple never said that. That is an actual incorrect quote. Whipple, in the Whipple paper, there was a comment by a guy named Banerjee, who was referring to this paper, but not by name. But we found this paper by a guy named Crommelin, who referred to overthrown trees that number 80 million. And he was referring to this paper. Well, here's the Russian original version, and Andy Bruno translated it. Here it says his estimate with a bunch of assumptions. The original assumption, clearly labeled as an assumption, was the area of the fallen forest. They didn't know that back then. That was a guess. So this is basically a WAG, 80 million trees. And then he estimated the total energy. And I didn't even notice until last night when I was looking at this that Crommelin got this wrong by a lot. So converting that to megatons, 2.4 megatons, which is actually, in my opinion, probably pretty close to being right. But the original source, it was about 100 megatons. So going back to primary sources is an important thing to be able to do. But some of these publications that people cite, they don't cite. They just take information that's been filtered, like a game of telephone, and nobody knows where it came from. And you actually have to collaborate with a historian who speaks Russian to figure out where it did come from. So when I gave this presentation 2 years ago at GSA in Anaheim, I looked at the Wikipedia page, and it very prominently says 80 million trees without a citation. So, you know, that was something that I kind of wanted to change. So we, with Andy Bruno, we published a comment called Matters Arising. This came out last April of 2025. This was published. And we did bring up the 80 million trees claim. We brought up a lot of other problems with that paper, and it ended up getting this BBC story turns out to be the only actual story, legitimate story in 2006. And then there were a few in 2007, but in 2008 there were a bunch of repeats. That's the anniversary of 1908, 2008. There were a lot of stories about Tunguska, including one in Scientific American, which did state 80 million trees. And then it continued to grow in what kind of looked like an exponential curve. Chelyabinsk was a big year because there were a lot of stories that mentioned Tunguska in that year, and it just took off and took on a life of its own. On the right-hand side, I did the same thing, but month by month. And so there was kind of a renucleation, and again, this was an anniversary. NASA, a NASA historian, cited 80 million trees. Didn't cite his source, but said 80 million trees, Yuri. It didn't really go anywhere much, didn't really increase until Google rolled out AI Overview. And that was, I went back and looked that up, that was May in 24. And I did some testing, and if you just, type, tell me about the damage from Tunguska, if you type that into the Google search box, it tells you 80 million trees. And it is citing this source. So really not much happened. And then it got boosted by AI. Here's another spike in the frequency. That was when 2024 YR4, the object that was on a potential impact trajectory, was discovered. And briefly, the probability got significantly high. So there were a lot of stories again. And when there's a lot of stories of a Tunguska-sized object, they're going to mention Tunguska. And if they mention Tunguska, they're going to mention 80 million trees. So it'll be interesting now that we've published this, and now that Wikipedia has changed, will that go down? I predict it won't. I predict it'll keep going up, but we'll see. Okay, so, the crater. So I did this a while ago, and you might want to try this yourself. Just type Tunguska in the text box, and these are the first three things that come up. The wrong picture, but we put ourselves on a search for what was the source of this crater. And 2 years ago, when I presented this at GSA, I got it wrong because it turns out there are a lot of weird clearings like this in Siberia, and we got the wrong one. And it is a place called, that's the Russian term for Devil's Cemetery, and it's another pseudoscience, very popular, mysterious place. And that photograph has been used for Devil's Cemetery, which turns out to be like 300 kilometers south of the actual Tunguska epicenter, too far away to have had anything to do with it. There it is in Google Maps and with the exact coordinates. Olga Popova, who was a co-author and is Russian and has access to good libraries and knows a lot of people, she figured out what it actually was. It was called Crater Rumeyko, which is downrange of where the impact epicenter was, something like 26 kilometers away. And she found what was the primary literature, including linked to the original photograph, which is cropped and rotated to be horizontal. It was taken out of I think out of an airplane. So that basically proves what the source of that picture is. That's generally the one that's used. And so anyway, it's everywhere. It's more widely used in clickbait, non-serious journalism, YouTube videos. It's used everywhere, with the implication that is some kind of crater associated with Tunguska. And now there's AI versions of it too. So this is an interesting thing. So Graham Hancock is very much a promoter of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And I ran across this. This was just last month. This was in June. And he posted this. And so, it implies that there was some panel of 26 scientists, which happens to be the exact same number as the number of scientists number of authors of the original Firestone paper in 2007. And I think it's like AI doesn't understand things. And so, it was probably created by AI, but this photograph caught my attention. So this is the thumbnail on the video. And I like squinted at the name tags and I couldn't read them. So I saw it on Twitter. So Twitter has this grok now. And I asked, well, who are these people? What do their placards say? And you probably recognize some of these names. At least the first four, I have no idea who this is. And I Googled her, and I think it's a made-up person. But if you look at the people, and I found there's actually a higher resolution where you can actually read their name tags. But I'm sure a lot of you know some of these people, and they're not these people. Those are just AI versions of them. So AI has gotten into the act. I mean, you can see there's sedimentary layers, and you can see like a fake version of the black mat, which looks more like a coal seam here. So it's just completely made up. So I just want to say something about how this information gets laundered. They're not necessarily, I mean, these are peer-reviewed papers, so they basically get stuff into peer review. And here's 3 examples, all having to, what I call airburst archaeology. They all have to do with places that they claim were destroyed by airburst. And the step 1 is questionable peer review. Basically, you get your pals to review it. And so these are the 3 papers. Aggressive promotion, and I'm going through this really quick. These weren't AI generated images, but they're recycled for all of these stories. And then the clickbait media, science media pick up on them using the same images. Then some of them get into legitimate general media. The Hopewell one actually got into the Washington Post, which was shocking to me. And then finally, pop culture and public acceptance. This Tal El Hammam paper made it into Final Jeopardy. How can we deal with it? How can we neutralize it? You got to publish. You got to go on to PubPeer, which is post-publication review. I strongly encourage people to do that. You don't even have to have an account, but if you find something wrong with a paper, put a comment, ask the authors. Here's a image from the Tal El Hammam paper that was tampered with. And then publishing review articles, publishing other articles, comments. Everybody's done that. Forcing corrections. Multiple corrections had to be published for the Tal El Hammam paper. And then finally, there was an editor's note published. And ultimately, those 2 have been retracted. And I predicted that 3rd one, the Syrian Abu Huraira one, is also going to be retracted. This is a picture of a whole lot of these glassy microspherules and melt glass that they claim to have found way after the fact, way after the dig. 150 pieces, some bigger than 1 0.4 centimeters in diameter. It's all gone. I put a link to this video in the comments, so you can watch that during the break or something. But Michael Shermer, the skeptic, was interviewed by George Howard, who was one of the authors, one of the leaders of the Comet Research Group. And I said, I'd love to hear his explanation why out of more than 150 pieces, none is left. And George, his quote is great. It's like asking to see data is ad hominem. It suggests fraud. It suggests that I'm accusing them of fraud. And all I want to do is like, okay, well, you presented data, you claim to have this stuff, where's the documentation? So, okay, oh, there we go. So anyway, we just submitted another one of these matters arisings like we did for the Hammam paper that got it retracted. I actually wrote to Andrew Moore, who was the lead author and who was the leader of the excavation, and he confirmed that at least that's the implication, because I asked a very direct a direct question: is there no melt glass remaining at all? And it basically said there's nothing left for further investigations. So I quoted that in the matters arising. So just to wrap up, what can you do about myths and misrepresentations? This is a very incomplete list. Don't repeat them. Post-publication review. You don't need to get a PubPeer account, but it's better, I think, if you publish under your own name and post comments. Publish comments on papers, matters arising, that sort of thing. Publish articles in non-technical literature, because Wikipedia uses those sources. AI uses those sources. And think about becoming a Wikipedia editor. They need subject matter experts as well. So I probably didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to take any if there is time.
And actually, you left about -20 seconds.